Hello guys, thanks for tuning in. So the topic of today's video is of course that I'm going to take a Ryzen 5 1600. That's a chip that came out I believe in 2017 with the first generation of the Ryzen processors, and I'm going to run it with this cooler that was intended for an Athlon X4 845, which came out back in 2016, and of course it's an Athlon cooler. And you can tell based on how small this cooler is. It's just minuscule, and it was intended for a 4-core chip without hyperthreading, and it's going to be used for a 6-core chip with hyperthreading. So we're just going to see what the results are and just how badly this tiny little cooler fares. Obviously, ideally, you'd use something much better, like something that even came with the CPU, but we just want to see what sort of results a tiny cooler like this would give on a modern chip that is also meant to have a way bigger cooler than this. I mean, look at the size of this tiny heat sink. So I'm definitely not going to recommend this until we see the results. And after we see the results, I'm probably still not going to recommend it. But yeah, I'm just going to switch out the 1600's current cooler, which is currently equipped with a Wraith Prism, so a much better cooler. And now I'm going to put this one on it and see just how badly it fares. And I'm going to try playing a few games and even running a couple of stress tests to see just how well this cooler can hold up, if it'll even boot and actually give us at all playable experiences in games. My guess is that it's probably going to function at idle, but once I try gaming, it might even shut down because of how hot the chip is going to get. So don't recommend that you guys try this at home. Actually, interestingly enough, guys, this very cooler is the same one that I had in my first ever PC build. It's one of the only few parts I still have from that, because I had the Athlon X4 845 CPU with this cooler, and I did okay for that part. And then for the graphics card, I had an R7 360. So very entry-level build at the time, but it could run GTA 5 at 30 FPS. Anyways, so the full specs of the machine I'm going to be running this test with are as follows. As you can see, it's a pretty modest machine, and currently, as I've said, it's equipped with a stock AMD Ryzen Prism cooler, which is the one that comes with the higher end Ryzen CPUs. So it's an even better one than the 1600, and I'm going to swap that out with this abysmal Athlon cooler I've just showed you. Let's get right into it. Okay, so before I actually go and swap the CPU cooler out, what I wanted to do is see how well the CPU performs with the current cooler, which is much more powerful, the Wraith Prism. So I just wanted to see what kind of numbers we're getting with that. The only reason GTA 5 looks so bad currently is because I'm using the lowest settings possible just to be able to max out the CPU and not the GPU, to put maximum strain on the CPU for testing purposes. But the game could look much better if I were to turn up the settings and still get about 30 FPS with max settings on this graphics card. It's not a bad graphics card, the GT 1030, honestly, if you're just interested in playing games like GTA 5. But anyway, as you can see now, I'm getting around 84 FPS. The CPU is maxed out. I mean, not usage-wise, but the GPU isn't maxed out, so the CPU is currently the weakest link. The clock speed's currently 3.425 gigahertz, and it typically ranges between 3.2 gigahertz and 3.6. And actually the power is around 70 watts, which is actually above the advertised 65 watt TDP, which means that our little cooler might have even more of a problem with it. Alright guys, so now that the CPU cooler on the 1600 is switched out to that inadequate Athlon one, I'm going to go ahead and boot up the PC, and we'll see if it even boots with such an inadequate cooler. The only reason I'm recording externally now is because the PC's being booted up. I'm going to go straight into the BIOS just to see the CPU temperature from right there. Well, that's certainly in the surprise. We might be at idle and in the BIOS, but the temperature on the CPU is at only 33 degrees Celsius. Much less than I would expect, to be honest. Well, we're going to go ahead and do some stress tests in games once we get into Windows. Okay guys, so here we are at idle and we're sitting at the surprisingly cool temperature of only 42 Celsius, but it is at idle, so we're going to run Cinebench, then try playing some games, and then for the final test run IDA 64, just to see if this cooler is truly adequate, as it is now seeming to be. So running Cinebench R23 multi-core. Keep an eye on the temperature here, it's already up to 56. Still very far from any point where damage might occur. Well, it just went up to 62 and now came back down a bit, so might be the max. Nope, going higher. Still a lot cooler than I would have expected. Guess this tiny little Athlon cooler packs a much bigger punch than it would seem. 66.25. That looks like it was our max temp. Well, back again, here we are in GTA 5, this time with the Athlon cooler, and the results are quite surprising. 57 degrees, 58 now, 58 degrees Celsius, but it's been hovering around 57 for a while. And that is after playing for several minutes, and it's only a little bit higher than it was with the Wraith Prism. That is what is shocking to me. I expected the temperature to be quite a bit higher with such a weak cooler, but apparently not. We're still able to stay around, at least it probably won't cross 60 degrees Celsius, even when playing for long amounts of time. And the frame rate is also very good. The only thing is the clock speed is slightly lower. It used to be 3450 megahertz, and now it's 3425. And I also noticed that the wattage went down from around 70 to, well, now it's hovering in the low 60s. But before it was even lower in the high 50s. So not a huge difference here, although it is clear that the Wraith Prism fared slightly better than the Athlon cooler, but still a very good gaming experience with the Athlon cooler here. Here we are in The Witcher, and if the game looks a bit strange to you, the aspect ratio, that's because I chose the lowest resolution possible to maximize the load on the CPU, so the image is a bit distorted. But anyway, right now the CPU temperature is hovering around 57, the clock speed's at what it was before in GTA, the wattage is a little bit lower actually, but either way, the CPU is not getting fully utilized like it was in GTA, because this game is too demanding for that compared to GTA, which is even less demanding. But the temperature again is no cause for concern at all, even though it is definitely a little higher than it would be with the Wraith Prism cooler. Okay, so here we have CSGO, guys. As you can see, the temperature is not too bad. It's actually lower than it was in the other ones, at only 51 degrees Celsius. The clock, well, before it was 3450, 3425 fluctuation, like what we saw in GTA 5 at the beginning when we were running with a Wraith Prism cooler. Excuse my terrible skills at this game. It also doesn't help that we're playing in 720p. But still, the performance is fine here, and actually the temperature is actually lower than normal, than it was with the other games, with this cooler. So overall, a perfectly fine gameplay experience, even with a game like CSGO, which is known for being more CPU demanding. We're not seeing any throttling of any kind whatsoever. So now for the final test. Okay, so now that we tested the games and everything, the only thing left to do, the ultimate test, is to run IDA 64 stress test for about an hour and see what happens, see if the temperature actually does get dangerously high now or not. My guess is probably not, even though IDA64 is rather brutal, just because of the temperatures we've seen on in the other situations. It seems that this little Athlon cooler can pull its own weight after all. But let's start the test. Okay guys, so after running the test for about an hour, now the temperature's gone down, but when it hit over here, along where it stayed flat, it was fluctuating between 59 and 60 degrees Celsius, which is honestly shockingly cool. It's not even really significantly warmer than the CPU was getting during some of the games that we were playing before. But anyway, I certainly expected it to hit more than only 60 degrees Celsius, but there we have it. Okay guys, so now that we have the results, I just want to say this video sort of started out as just doing this for fun, trying to run the 1600 with this puny little heatsink and see what would happen. But there's a main takeaway from this video. That is, if you have some kind of cooler, like an Athlon cooler, something like this, something very old that you think might be totally obsolete, and you have a CPU, but you don't have a newer cooler or the stock cooler that came with that CPU, maybe you bought it used, you can probably get away with using something like this. And by something like this, I just mean some old cooler for another CPU, because it seems older CPU coolers still have sufficiently good cooling technology to cool some modern chips, as long as it's not a very high-end CPU, like something like a 10900K. I would not at all recommend using just some random cooler that you found laying around, or some old one from an old build. But anyway, you can probably use some old cooler as long as you don't have a CPU that uses a lot of power, essentially. But either way, if you're not sure, you could probably just try running it with the worst cooler if you really don't want to buy a more expensive one, and see what happens, see what temperatures are like at idle, and if they're too high, don't even bother trying to game on it, because you might end up damaging something. Alright, that's about it for today, guys. Thanks for watching!